Now, Amnesty International has a report out looking at the state of human rights in the Middle East, and it says the lack of international justice only emboldens authorities to crack down on their citizens and freedom of speech. The report singles out the case of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, whose murder inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last October led to a global outcry. Amnesty laments that those responsible are yet to be brought to justice. The report also highlights the jailing of rights activist Ahmed Mansour in the United Arab Emirates and Nabil Rajab in Bahrain, who are both in prison for criticizing their governments on social media. And Amnesty says Egypt has become a more dangerous place for critics of the government than at any other time in recent history. Well, let's speak to Heba Morayef, who's the Middle East Regional Director at Amnesty International. She's live from Beirut. Thank you for being with us, Heba. Let's talk about the big picture first. And it's a worrying picture of human rights in the region, certainly, according to your report. What is fueling this cycle of abuse, and what's emboldened governments, as you say in your report, to commit these abuses?
Well, at Amnesty International, we think two things have been happening in the last few years. On the one hand, you've had a number of authoritarian regimes trying to crack down on any form of dissent, designed to ensure that the uprisings that happened in 2011 can never happen again. And on the other hand, you have a lot of Western governments who might, at certain points, have engaged in discussions about human rights in their foreign policy, willing to look the other way, either because of security interests or migration interests or obviously economic interests in the region. So.
You say Western governments are willing to look the other way, but there has been a global outcry since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Many of these governments, like Saudi Arabia, are now under the spotlight as they've never been before. Some countries, like Germany, refusing to do arms deals with Saudi Arabia. Could this lead to concrete change and put other governments in check?
We think the Jamal Khashoggi case was incredibly important in 2018, if not one of the most important events, and not just because of the horror of what actually happened, but because of that very rare international response. And Amnesty International had been documenting human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia for years with very little international interest in it. So I think the horror of what happened to Jamal Khashoggi has created some momentum, which we've seen translate, at least on the part of Denmark, Finland and Norway, into a decision to halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia, given how they are being used in Yemen for the commission of human rights and abuses of international humanitarian law. Our hope is that that momentum can be sustained, in particular towards Yemen, but also for renewed scrutiny on Saudi Arabia. We are still calling for an independent UN investigation into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, because only an independent UN investigation can actually bring to light what happened.
And your report highlights three countries in particular, Heba, Egypt, Iran and Saudi Arabia, where you say the crackdown on dissent and civil society intensified significantly in 2018. Why do you believe the international response to violations in these countries hasn't been inadequate, as you say? I can see why in the case of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, but what about Iran?
For us, 2018 was a very significant year for Iran because of the 7,000 arrests that took place in the aftermath of protests. Significant in their breadth, significant in the cruelty of that. And here again, we've seen international actors, including a number of European governments, fail to raise human rights concerns. I think for us at Amnesty International, in the post-2011 moment, there was a time when foreign policy was often combined with human rights on the table. And since then, we've gone back to an era of realpolitik, where human rights just falls off that list of issues to raise.
Just briefly, one last question, Heba, before we let you go. Is the picture bleak throughout the region? Have there been some improvements, though?
We have noted a number of limited improvements, often legislative, in Lebanon or in Palestine or in Tunisia when it comes to fighting violence against women, for example. And I would also point to the fact that in Tunisia, it's not all black, because the Truth Commission in Tunisia did manage to refer to trial a number of prosecutions for crimes of the past. So we have some hopes around accountability, both in Tunisia and in Lebanon. But I think our report focuses on the broader picture because of the gravity of human rights abuses occurring elsewhere.
Heba Morayef of Amnesty International, thank you very much for speaking to us.